First up, I guess, look, we might start with Andrew. Welcome to, you've just arrived in the nick of time, as they say. We've heard a lot this morning, infrastructure challenges that come with rapid population and housing growth. Do they continue to be a key focus in your council area? Can you tell us what framework you have in place to manage those challenges?
Infrastructure remains to be a challenge, will be ongoing. Mount Barker it will be a city, or is a city. The locals think it's a city already, but 20 years' time, 70 to 80,000 people, making it the largest urban area outside of Adelaide. We, in terms of frameworks, managing infrastructure, council has had to be fairly inventive, given that when the land was rezoned, 1,300 hectares, without any staging, in 2009, it did so without a government that was willing to put a plan out that anticipated the infrastructure that was required. So council put a structure plan up place. It participated in securing from developers contributions. To do that wasn't easy because the legislation in South Australia has never supported developer contributions as it has in the eastern states. It's been resisted by the development community, although the Malinowskis government more recently is looking at a form of legislated development contribution as one option. Now, whether that comes to pass, we don't know. But for the purposes of Mount Barker, we've worked with the development community to maintain solidarity in that community, for them to contribute to infrastructure, be it for roads, be it for public infrastructure, be it ovals or recreation facilities. That's been our model to date, albeit very much driven by relationships and working with the development sector and government.
Andrew, just while we've got you on that point, do you feel that on occasions Mount Barker, through no fault of its own, cops a bad rap, that people driving through Mount Barker see a lot of housing development, people living in Mount Barker say, well, they're, one, maybe two, maybe three ambulances now. Has, and I'll say that not even the previous government, probably the government before that, have they let Mount Barker down a bit?
Look, driving through Mount Barker, it sounds as if you drive through Mount Barker a little bit. It is confronting. Wellington Road, for example, I travel up and down Wellington Road every day to Wistow. The houses are like mushrooms there, and I'm sure that it leaves an impression to people that's not always favourable. Having said that, there's a lot of people that see it as progress. So it's a mixed bag and a mixed rap that we get. In terms of the government, there has been acknowledgements by governments over the time since it was rezoned. I think there's probably been about 3 governments since then. And famously, I think John Rao was the most outspoken, who said that there would never be another Mount Barker, not ever, ever. We'll wait and see whether that happens. But, I think most recently, the obvious development of Mount Barker has really crystallised in people's minds, and the government has, I think, now understood that it really needs to do something and has stepped up to the plate. It should have a long time ago, but I think it's now that it's in front of you, it's in your face, that they've decided that they'll do something.
Thank you very much for that, Kristen. From a Murray Bridge point of view, you're looking at building thousands, I think it's 3,100 houses, to keep up with demand. How's that going, and what is council doing to back that plan and make sure that happens?
Thanks, Mike. So, look, from a principal perspective, it's really about engagement, collaboration, and working towards our vision of thriving communities. So, certainly, we're trying to put in proactive groundwork in the first instance. So we've invested considerably in developing a community infrastructure model. So over the last couple of years, we've done considerable work with key consultants to try and determine what our infrastructure needs are with a growing community. So we've got a couple of scenarios, one by 2032 and then an ultimate scenario by 2050. And what that really demonstrates is how much we need in terms of physical infrastructure, so the road network infrastructure, stormwater, etc., as well as the social infrastructure that we need to create a livable and thriving community. So Council's been really proactive in that space. We're now at the point where it's ramping up really quickly. We're working very closely with developers as well, and we know that we've got considerable growth ahead of us, and that's really exciting for our community, but it does mean that we need to work in partnership with the state government, with the federal government, and certainly with the developers as well. So as part of the outcome of our community infrastructure model work, we are putting together an infrastructure scheme, so whereby we'll be engaging with developers that's kind of one step beyond an infrastructure agreement under the planning code, and be able to implement an infrastructure scheme. So it's the first council-led infrastructure scheme in South Australia, so that's a big chunk of work for us.
Does it frighten you in a way? I won't say frighten, it's probably a bit strong, but does it concern you in a way that either skill shortages to build these houses and almost another day, another builder collapse in this state, does that all feed into it's great in theory, perhaps a little more difficult in practice?
Absolutely, and I think that's the case across South Australia, but particularly in regional areas. I mean, a lot of the builders at the moment are still working on flood recovery. So, the resources are going into rebuilding shacks and holiday homes and all of the infrastructure required around that. So, yeah, absolutely. Skill shortage more broadly, and particularly in the building sector, yeah, it's certainly a challenge.
But when you mention that, that's another dimension that I hadn't even thought of, the flood recovery program, and people that I've spoken to have said, well, we're in a long queue. I won't say they said we're in the far queue, they just said we're in a long queue, and making all of that fit, it seems like almost an impossibility.
It is most certainly a challenge. I think that's where we're going to need significant commitment from the state government and federal government, and working in partnership. Local government certainly can't do it on our own.
Clinton, you've heard Matthew's lively speech, I think we could say. His presentation was excellent, as we all knew it would be, but has that given you any ideas, even as much as seeing that animated commercial, which I thought was brilliant and told a story that was so simple but yet so effective? Do coming to things like this and seeing presentations like that, do that spark your enthusiasm and give you ideas?
Absolutely, and happy to play a small part in giving you a little bit of fodder for that. Look, what it shows me, and look, I'm again lucky, I see this a lot. Our elected members, our local governments, they know what is going on in their community, they know what is happening in their streets far better than the relevant officers in state departments, and that's no criticism of the state, but we actually understand what's going on. And so what I saw there was a perfect example of just a completely different way of looking at things, which I observe in the regions anyway. They're a much more creative, innovative bunch by and large anyway, and I see that again. But that's just a different way of looking at a problem. It's selling the positives. You understand what makes those communities tick, and that's actually often people can't perhaps talk about that when they say what do they like about coming to those areas, but that's ultimately what it is. Those communities where the mayor and the CEO are in lockstep with the elected members and the community, those are the communities that are genuinely thriving. And there are solutions to all of these problems we're talking about happening out in local government at the moment. The issue is the solution for the state is not a one-size-fits-all. We've actually got to take the time to understand what's happening, why it's working, and then look for other opportunities to recreate that.
Matthew, back to you. I guess, I don't know, is Chris Minns looking down over his shoulder? Are you coming for him or Albo? Or seems to me you've got you like what you do, and it's politically motivated. Is everyone in Dubbo as excited about this as you are?
sorry, this is, I assume, on?
Yeah, I think so. Or if not, there's another microphone there.
Sure.
Yep.
Yep, right. Okay, yep. So, which part? Are they excited about 3D toilets? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, we could start with 3D toilets, I guess. I meant the concept that, is it a collaborative approach within council? Because we don't often see that sort of advertising to attract people to a town, certainly. And I'm nothing against Dubbo, but I would have, I wouldn't even know how to get to Dubbo, to be honest. But so there must be a driving force behind all of this.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things there. One is that I think people in general in Dubbo love the idea that they're being talked about, and there's some activity and some people thinking that this is a great place to go. So that's fantastic. One of the challenges, though, has been the 7 cities that we started off with, and we've now grown that to 15 cities. It's regional cities, New South Wales now, rather than Evo cities we've got. But one of the challenges when it was Evo cities is every now and again you'd get a new mayor come along to one of those cities and they'd say, why are we putting in 50 grand to this? No, we think we'll pull out. And I was chairperson of Evo cities at the time, so I'd get on the phone to the mayor, I'd go up and see that council, and they'd say, I don't think we get much out of it because I don't know that people have moved here because they saw that ad. Can you show me someone that has? Said, well, I can't go and grab someone off the street and show you, there's Billy, he moved here because of that ad. And it probably takes, like marketing any product, it probably takes about 10 different things that happen, 10 different instances where you see something before you finally go, you know what? I actually am hungry now. I'll go and buy that hamburger after seeing all these other things that trigger something. So it takes a few times, and you need to almost herd the cats along to make sure they're all on board, because someone might want to be a bit of a hero in their own local community and say, I'm going to save $50,000 and cut out that waste of money for Evo cities without looking at the big picture. And that sort of stuff absolutely is big picture. You're going to do it today and you're not going to see results tomorrow. You're not going to see results for some time. And it's also hard to say that just because of that one campaign, someone moved. So you really need some people driving it, and you need some people who can see the big picture, that's more the challenge. So not so much your own local community, but the other collaborators that you get on board, that's the challenge, to get them focused.
And Matthew, in Dubbo itself, the population growth that we've seen, and I think over the last 20 years, and it's looked to be on that graph on a decline of sorts, were those houses already there and empty, or were those houses to accommodate the influx built?
Certainly we've had good, strong building numbers. That was one of the graphs I was actually tempted to put up, but I only had 20 minutes to talk, so I wanted to limit what I had on there. But the building numbers have been very strong as well. And there's a councillor that I served with on a previous council who he wasn't a builder, but he said he linked directly building activity, and we get our building activity summary every month, building activity to economic growth in the community. So when he saw good building numbers, he went, well, there you go. There are so many other things that come off that shows a good, strong community economically. Because again, why are people building houses? Well, people have got to be moving to live in those houses, and then you've got all the tradies associated with that house. So the building numbers have been strong as well over that whole period of time.
And what about tradie numbers now?
Yeah, it's a struggle. There's no doubt about it. This is part of the problem. Part of the problem, and the 3D printed toilet block was a classic example. Some people in our community said, here you are taking jobs away from tradies. And I said, well, if you can find the tradies that we're taking the jobs away from, send them to me, because there aren't the tradies there. Now, obviously that 3D printed toilet or 3D printed housing only really replaces bricklayers. You cannot get a bricklayer for any money anywhere at the moment. It's almost impossible to get bricklayers. So we're not doing people out of jobs, but tradies, that is an issue without a doubt. And even talking to TAFE recently, the number of people who are going through some of the trade, TAFE, is New South Wales, I'm not sure what the equivalent in South Australia is of TAFE, but TAFE. Oh, there you go. Wow. We stole it off you, obviously. So in TAFE, the tradie numbers are at historically low levels, so we've got to make it more exciting. And I think part of the problem there, getting very deep now, is that when government started saying you can't finish school at year 10, you've got to go to year 12, I know some of the mates I went to school with, that would have been a disaster for them to go to year 12. They were great doing a trade, and they're great in their businesses they're running now as a tradie, so making people go to year 12 probably doesn't suit everyone, and it's a challenge now because it was seen that everyone had to go to university, but we still need someone to fix a block toilet, and you're not going to learn that at university.
Can I ask, just before we move away from you, Matthew, that during the pandemic in particular, have you got the demographic profile that moved in to Dubbo or before that, And are we talking about people that are bringing their whole families and there are enough jobs in town if both members want to work, or are we talking mainly young people who have said, you know, stuff Sydney, I get where you're coming from, we just want a change of lifestyle?
No, definitely the family environment, and this was before the pandemic as well, and certainly after the pandemic. When you look at our population demographic again, compare it to the state, then our population drops by comparison in the 18 to 30 bracket. So when people finish school and they want to go off, we've got universities in Dubbo, but they want to go on and discover the world, go off to Sydney, the bright lights, etc. And that's probably okay. Let them go and discover what the downside is. So then when they come back with their family, they realise that, wow, this is a fantastic life. So people start moving back late 20s, early 30s. Sometimes when they've got a family, when they've got a partner, they realise they want to buy a house, they can't afford to in Sydney. And all those things were the same during the pandemic because, again, people had that impetus to move out there. Young people still want to discover the world, and that's fine. And when you're 18, you're bulletproof, go and discover the world. You're not going to get COVID if you're 18 because you're too bulletproof to get COVID. So I think the demographics stay the same, and that's okay. That's probably how our community is built anyway. I heard some stats before about the average age of people in South Australia, in some places around South Australia. So the average age of people in Dubbo is 36. The average age of people in the state is about 37. So younger in the state, younger in Dubbo, but that's not surprising to me because a lot of people come back in their late 20s.
Thanks for that. Andrew, when I was a kid, a long time ago, Mount Barker was almost a regional town. It was somewhere, we used to take my grandmother to a nursing home there for her summer vacations. It was similar to that. Bridgewater seemed a long way away from Adelaide in those days. You look at Mount Barker now, is there any advice? You know, some people might say, well, you've had the dream run. There is the population growth there. There is the explosion. You've got the extra interchange onto the freeway. But is there any advice you could give other regional areas, council areas, about how to do it right and things to avoid when you have such rapid expansion?
Oh, thanks, Mike. Glad that you're speaking with experience and some knowledge. So you're always welcome back in Mount Barker.
I'm there. I'm regularly there. I love it.
Hopefully for all the good stories. Look, in terms of advice, Mount Barker, it was written in the scriptures that, or the stars, I suppose I should say, that it was always going to grow. It's located. Its location for a start, and then of course the freeway going through in the 60s, it had to happen, and it did. I guess if I was a member of state government of the day, they touted Monarto, and had it been a few years later, it might well have been that it was Monarto. It just didn't happen, and then the next best option was Mount Barker because Adelaide was growing north and south, so it was always going to happen that there was going to be a population base in the hills. Really, what should have happened that didn't happen was that there had to be an acknowledgement of that, and there had to be an embracement of that by all levels of government in the 60s, early 60s, and plan it. Now, South Australia had a fine reputation of planning cities. Elizabeth, one of the most recent, I suppose, in modern era, and probably the last example. Mount Barker is not a planned city by any stretch. Having said that, we're trying to retrofit a lot of good planning principles. So, it's really up to governments of all persuasions to embrace the future, to look to the future and to have long-term thinking. Now, that might be an oxymoron these days. But I think it's still a very real aspiration, a very real objective of governments. I'd like to think that our council has been forward-looking, and so we've put into place a lot of effort to build community infrastructure. Mount Barker, for those of you who don't know, is not serviced by SA Water, so we have no sewer system from SA Water. We service Mount Barker. We are looking at $100 million investment in the next year for a new sewer plant. Not really glamorous, not really, the sort of thing that kids could play on, although, who knows. But
is it 3D printed?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I'd like to get one of those. It might be cheaper than $100 million. But we've gone to the LGFA and said, are you going to be good for us for the 100 million? And of course it'll be paid back over a long term through the service charges. But it's the sort of stuff that, really in South Australian context, local government don't get involved with. But why is Mount Barker doing it? Why is the council doing it? Well, one, the water market was de-legislated. SA Water won't come to Mount Barker, and the alternative is packaged plants that aren't really efficient. So the council's taken a leading role in providing that confidence. It has, in a sense, become a de facto utility. And again, I'm probably speaking in the old days, since Mike wanted to talk about the old days, about the good old days of having utilities when they really were utilities, and they did facilitate economic development. These days, SA Water being corporatised has probably lost its way in terms of providing that utilitarian role that we were used to back in the day. So, long story short, I think state governments should look hard and fast at not just the growth agenda, i.e., we want more people, but the role of their utilities, SA Waters, and so on, in terms of facilitating infrastructure and investment ahead of time to help de-risk and give confidence to the state. If I can just close by saying Mount Barker, by any measure, is a success story. It is a success story. It could have been better, but it's still a success story, and I think it's credit to the council being solid, steady, and credit to the community that are in Mount Barker that it is a success story. It might not work in other places, but in terms of other tips, well, there's a few others, but I'll probably run out of time for the moment, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I do. I love Mount Barker. I go there often. Kristen, whilst we're on regional areas, and the topic of this discussion panel is, can local government deliver population growth? In Murray Bridge, is it a case, and I'll just go back anecdotally, I reckon it would have been 30 years ago, someone in the room's going to be able to correct me, and I went to a big announcement there, and we flew up in a helicopter and we landed on the side of the road, and whoever was the minister at the time said, this is where we're going to have the state's newest prison. And Mobilong was there. It was just a wide landscape there with nothing on it. Okay, that was a long time ago. It shows you how old I am. So, it was touted at the time, this is going to create incredible jobs growth, prison warders, and I assume inmates as well, but service industries as well as that. But now is Murray Bridge, does it have that feel that if it wasn't for Darren Thomas, for instance, that there just wouldn't be the jobs there?
Nice segue between Mobilong Prison. Look, Thomas Foods is integral to economic growth. So since the fire in 2018, the site's been rebuilt, and it's impressive. It's huge. 400 staff, in the first instance, and then, probably several thousand over the next few years as it ramps up. What is really important for Murray Bridge and the region, however, is that there's diversity in terms of our economy. So that there's diversity not only in agri-food businesses and agriculture, but there are other industries that are coming in as well. So Monarto is an area for economic growth. We've got Vercura, who are setting up there as a subsidiary of Velo, so a large investor there in an innovation hub. And there are numerous other small businesses, there are orchard businesses that are diversifying into dehydrated fruit and vegetable meal, ready meals, for example. There's a whole range of diverse industry in our region, as well as the traditional, dairy farmers and so on. So yes, Thomas Foods plays a really key role, and it's not just the on-the-floor staff of the old days of an abattoir, but it's certainly far more high-tech these days as well. However, I think a diverse economy is critical to the region and critical for economic growth and encouraging population growth as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris. And I just saw some questions. Will those Slido questions pop up on the screen? I've got to have X-ray vision to read them. It was just on the screen where the clock is. No? Timer. Oh well, no, there was some text there as well. But no, it mightn't have been Slido. But while we're at it, and I'm not sure if I'm meant to be doing this, but are there any questions from the audience that anyone would like to ask? Now is your time of any of our panel today. Oh.
Whether Kristen can comment.
Yeah, hang on, Rob. We'll get a microphone to you. No, yes, we are. Yes. The Honourable the Rob Kerrin is going to ask a question.
Kristen, would you like to just comment on the role of migration over the last decade or so to Murray Bridge?
Thanks for the question. So it's been critical for Murray Bridge in terms of growth. So not only are we trying to retain our existing community and young people through having a regional study hub there, for example, but certainly we are a welcoming city, so we have that status of a welcoming city. The former mayor, Brenton Lewis, and the current mayor, Wayne Thorley, are very strong advocates for encouraging diversity in our community, and we celebrate our diverse community, and most definitely that will be a key aspect of growth in our region.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Kristen. Yes, question over here. The one at the back. I think we had the one at the back first, so yes, if you'd like to get up and announce yourself, please.
Sure.
Yeah, it's on. You're
It's on.
right to go.
Yeah, so Matt Hunt from the Office for Regional Housing, State Government. Question for Mayor Dickerson. In terms of the people moving to Dubbo, with your recent population growth, do you find that the majority of those are making the commitment and buying a house or getting one built before they move, or is there a real need for rental housing that people sort of want to try before they buy?
So they will typically come from Sydney, where they sell a house in Sydney that's worth $3 million and they've got maybe $1 million of equity, and come to Dubbo and the median house price blew us away recently when it hit $500,000. So people come from Sydney and go, wow, I can afford a house. So more often than not, they're buying a house. We have got rental stress as well in terms of not enough rentals. The vacancy rate sits at 0.2% or something ridiculous like that, hovers around that. So it's hard for them to buy or to find a house to buy or to find a house to rent, but typically they are tending to buy rather than rent if they can find a house.
Great question. Down to my left. I think
Hello.
That's it. You're right.
Right, got it working now. James Jackson from Mount Barker, and it is interesting. There's so much negative press all the time about how things change. The good old days where Mount Barker had two abattoirs where they're killing goats, killing pigs, a tannery that stunk the house out. You'd nearly vomit and you walk out in the street when they were really going for it. And now the town, when they shut down, the headlines were 400 jobs lost. Is this the end of Mount Barker? And what's happened is Mount Barker's just gone ahead. We've swapped those businesses for Gillette Cosmetics, for Spring Smoked Salmon and 127 wineries. So we reckon that's a good improvement. One thing I've just got to say this to Andrew and what the council, one of their secret strategies, and I'm sure Dubbo's got this, and I know Murray Bridge does, is they work with the property development industry, they work with the businesses and everything else on a very approachable, normal way. Just about every planner, every engineer hands out their mobile phone number so people can talk to them, because anyone that's in development, it's always in a hurry, it's always urgent. You don't have to wait 3 days to get a response. That flexibility and working relationship is what makes the good areas drive a bit harder and work a bit better. And the council's policy when that rezoning happened, and it was so big, 1,300 hectares, to go out and purchase greenfield sites to put in sporting facilities and ovals, etc., for that future population, despite the government not allowing for it, was once again something that set Mount Barker up to look long term for the next 50 years. So they do it well. I'm sure Dubbo, I know I'm going to go visit it again. It's been a while since I was there. Visit it again, but I'm sure it comes down to that relationship and communication between business, local government, council and all that. Get that communication right, get that flexibility working, you achieve a lot more.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the question I assume from that is that how you're all either doing it, or is that the aspiration? We'll work down the list. We'll start with you, Matthew.
So very briefly, when I first became mayor in 2011, I heard a lot of feedback from the development community that our development staff were terrible to work with, exactly the opposite of your point you're making there. And our development staff said, these developers are terrible to work with. So I put together a thing called a Mayoral Developers Forum, and I talked to people in local government in Sydney, and they say, that's terrible, putting developers and development staff in the one room, surely that's open for corruption. I said, well, we make sure that they leave their brown paper bags at the door when they come in, but we actually do those, and we do those twice a year, where we do have a forum, maybe 60, 80 people. We say, everyone involved in development in Dubbo, builders, developers, financiers, solicitors, everyone that's involved in any way, shape or form, come along. We give them an update on where things are up to, and they get a chance to speak to each other, and exactly as this gentleman said, make sure you build those relationships so that you're not sitting down with a planning staff member in a confrontational situation because you're not happy about something. You've actually got a relationship before you start. And as a classic example, last week we had our latest one, and there was a real estate person there in that talk, and we gave a presentation, and she put her hand up to ask a question. She said, I had an approach the other week where there's a business that wants to come to Dubbo and they need 200 beds, and is there anything you can do about that at council? And I said, well, no, we can't do anything. But I said, what you just said there, I saw about 5 developers pop their heads up and say, let me go and talk to this person. So as soon as we finish the presentation, you just stand there and they'll come and find you, I guarantee it. So you can build that relationship, but also grab opportunities like that particular one.
Clinton, I'll come down to your end here, just because we've got to get through a bit of material here. Is that, as Matthew's just described it, is that a template of how it should work?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt that the problems are bigger than all of us can handle individually, and those positive relationships and partnerships are where it's really working. So that's where I see a real opportunity with the HAF announcements coming through. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if regions could form a disproportionate kind of, I'll say, grab on that money, but that is a real opportunity for all of us to come together and actually make sure that regions get their fair share of that spending, because this is a proper quote, I think, Matthew. I'm Sound of Music, we're going right back now. I might be a Dewey idealist, but wouldn't it be nice if the politics was not involved in the policy and the planning? We all know there are decisions that need to be made around where ideally the state might want that funding to go. But wouldn't it be great if all of those other regions could actually have a good share of that? And I think if we all come together, and the property investors, the developers, all of that, they'll complain, they'll happily throw rocks, but that's their job. They've got members to look after as we do. But I know when we're in the room and we're having those face-to-face conversations, we've all got the same problems, but the solutions are actually really coming together and partnering on that. So it is absolutely a critical way of dealing with the problem, I think.
Thanks, Clinton. Rob.
Sorry. I'd be interested to know your opinion, because looking locally here, we've got Concordia coming on stream, Roseworthy going to be growing in the next few years. How strong do you believe Mount Barker has been grown, or its growth is due to Adelaide? And then the next question is, what's being done for employment lands in the area?
Look, thanks for that question. I don't think that Mount Barker's growth really is dependent on Adelaide in any sense of the word, except that about 65% of our population commutes to Adelaide for work. So in that sense, you could argue there is a dependency. In terms of employment lands in Mount Barker, there's very strong development of Totnes as the area between Mount Barker, Littlehampton. That's a very strong growth area. There's not enough employment land, I suppose, in Mount Barker, but we do look to employment being provided, alternative employment being provided, or filling the spectrum to Murray Bridge and further east, as well as Adelaide. There are employment lands being provided for in Mount Barker, but Mount Barker being Mount Barker, it is quite hilly, so the cost of development of employment land in Mount Barker is an impediment. Notwithstanding that, as I said, Totnes is an exception. It's obviously on the freeway, so the cost of development's outweighed by the strategic location. Mount Barker, really, its forte going forward will be in the white-collar technical type of employment. As I said, I think Murray Bridge provides added employment options for our community. We know that we want to diversify and improve our employment base in Mount Barker, and that's a challenge for us going forward.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, would you like to have a quick 30-second sum up, each of you? Give us your best shot, your best selling message for what you're doing and why you're doing it well.
Go, Clint, first. You go first, Clint. No, you go first. I want to use some of your words that I can peel off then.
I'll have a crack at one or the other. Look, I think the solutions are there. Look to your local governments. You're all partnering with your local governments. You know what's working. And then I think we look at how do we actually, with that focus on localism, as I was talking about before, the true key to success, I think, then becomes a connected localism across the entire system of what we're doing. And that's where I think we can really not only elevate our regions, but start to get some outcomes for our communities that they deserve, quite frankly.
Thank you. Kristen.
Thanks. So Murray Bridge, we're aiming to create a future city that is accessible to Adelaide, that people can travel to and from if they want to, that they can live in Mount Barker, as said, and travel to Murray Bridge to work. It is a place that has not only the sense of community that people seek out in a regional town, but also has the livability factor of the river. So there's some real benefits, I think, and we're creating a great city. We're creating a great community.
Thank you very much. We're getting some great 30-second answers here.
I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago, but I think that the greatest opportunity in the long term for South Australia to add to its state domestic product is to look at mass transport to the east and down across to Murray Bridge and then down to Victor Harbour. I think that's the greatest single multiplier effect the state could look forward to with big picture thinking. And the last thing I'll say is that the only thing I ever got in a brown paper bag was a Vegemite sandwich.
Fair enough. Matthew, the last word.
So I want to address specifically the question that's on the screen there. Can local government deliver population growth? There are lots of things that I could talk about that are things you could do, physical things you can do with direct outcomes that you could point to, but never, ever, ever underestimate consumer confidence, consumer sentiment. If people have got confidence in your council, in your community, if they hear positive things about your community, it's hard to say that person has moved here or brought a business here because it felt good, but it does happen. So whatever you can do to deliver a positive message, to deliver confidence, to deliver harmonious positive messaging, that I guarantee will make a difference, but you'll never be able to measure it.